Oak Creek Memorial smells like antiseptic and floor wax under fluorescent lights that hum their mechanical monotone in the trauma bay. 6 in the morning. The shift change happens in controlled chaos, nurses trading reports, residents checking orders, the institutional breathing of a hospital that never actually sleeps. Margaret Walsh moves through the corridors like a woman who knows exactly where every piece of equipment lives. 15 years. 1,948 shifts on this floor, and she's never once looked lost. Her scrubs are navy blue, faded from washings, and her name badge sits below a small pin she never explains, tarnished metal that catches light like it's made from something that fell from the sky. She checks the monitor on bed for without being asked. The patient's oxygen saturation reads 94%. She adjusts the nasal cannula by half a liter, watches the number climb to 98, and moves on. Muscle memory. Hand steady enough to trust. Her fingers reach for the coffee in the break room at 6:47. The cup is cold. She'd poured it 20 minutes ago and gotten pulled into assisting with a chest tube placement, a procedure Dr. Ashford had fumbled through while Margaret stood 3 feet away, watching, saying nothing. The coffee is bitter now. She wraps both hands around the ceramic like she's drawing warmth from a fire that stopped burning years ago. That's when her hands betray her. Just a tremor. A small one. The kind that lasts maybe 2 seconds. The kind that means the weight of 15 years is finally adding up to something her body can't hide anymore. She steadies the cup against the counter. Breathes. 1 measured inhalation. The tremor passes. No one saw it. No one ever sees anything about Margaret Walsh except that she's reliable and tired and somehow still shows up for the worst shifts without complaining. The break room is the color of institutional beige, the kind of beige that makes you forget what color actually is. A window overlooks the parking lot where the morning sun is already turning the asphalt into a mirror. 2 other nurses are sitting at the corner table, Jennifer from night shift and Carolyn, who's been on the trauma floor even longer than Margaret, though by Ashford's accounting, they're both dinosaurs waiting for extinction. Jennifer is laughing about something. Carolyn is reading through an email on her phone, her expression tightening with each line. Margaret pulls out a chair. The legs scrape against tile, a small sound, but in the break room it carries. The way sounds do when you're about to be erased. Jennifer's laugh dies first. She glances up, catches Carolyn's eye, and something passes between them. Not hostility. Not exactly. Something closer to apology. Carolyn stands very slowly, tucking her phone into her pocket. "I need to check on my patients," she says. She doesn't look at Margaret. She hasn't looked at Margaret since the thing with Ashford 3 weeks ago, since the staff meeting where he'd said, "Some people mistake experience for competence," and everyone had known exactly who he meant. Jennifer follows half a second later, carrying her empty yogurt container to the sink. The water runs. The garbage disposal grinds. 2 nurses who used to bring Margaret coffee on double shifts, who used to ask about her late husband and listen to the answers, suddenly have somewhere else to be. Margaret sits alone at the table. The coffee is colder now. She doesn't drink it. Dr. Ashford arrives at 7:15 in pressed surgical greens that look like they came off a hanger 30 seconds ago. His badge reads Chief of Surgery in letters that catch light. He's 43 years old and built like a man who goes to the gym specifically to be intimidating, with the kind of jawline that photographs well in hospital marketing materials. He walks through the trauma floor with his tablet, reviewing assignments, his eye scanning the whiteboard where shift rotations are printed in dry erase marker. He stops at Margaret's name. Studies it like he's reading a diagnosis he's already decided is terminal. At 7:20, he finds her in Trauma Bay 2, where she's finishing a blood draw from a post-op patient. The draw is clean, 1 stick, right vessel, no hemolysis. The patient, a man named Dimitri, recovering from an abdominal surgery that should never have gone as smoothly as it did with Ashford holding the retractor, barely feels the needle. Margaret has hands like a surgeon's, only better, because surgeons practice. Margaret's done this 4,000 times. Her hands know the exact angle, the exact depth, the exact moment to extract. Ashford watches for maybe 10 seconds. Long enough to see her execute a perfect draw. Long enough that he could have learned something if he was capable of learning from people he'd already decided were obsolete. "Miss Walsh," he says. "Never nurse. Not for Margaret. You're scheduled for another double today. 4 p.m. through 4 a.m. We're short on the night shift, and frankly, the younger nurses can't handle the pace." He pauses. The pause is intentional. It's the kind of pause that gives you time to feel the insult settling in. "I hope those old knees hold up for 16 hours on your feet." Margaret labels the blood sample with her free hand. The handwriting is precise, each letter formed with intention. She caps the tube, sets it in the centrifuge. Then she turns and meets his eyes with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse things than a surgeon with a Napoleon complex. One measured breath. In. Out. "They've held up through worse, doctor," she says. Her voice doesn't waver. Doesn't rise. Doesn't contain a single note of defensiveness. It contains, instead, the kind of quiet certainty that makes him pause for a fraction of a second. His jaw tightens just slightly. He wasn't expecting that. Ashford's used to nurses apologizing, accepting, shrinking. Margaret doesn't shrink. It's that quality, that absolute refusal to apologize for existing, that he finds most intolerable about her. "See that they do," he says, and turns away. The day hasn't started yet. That's the thing no one tells you about battles, they begin long before anyone throws the first weapon. They begin in small moments. A coffee cup trembling. A colleague standing up too quickly. A silence where there used to be laughter. They begin the moment someone decides that you've become inconvenient. Ashford walks past the nursing station and makes a note on his tablet. He's already formulating the next step. Margaret Walsh is 15 years in, which means she's earned certain protections, certain respect from the older attendings, certain institutional weight. But Dr. Jonathan Ashford has been chief of surgery for 4 years and has made it very clear that his department will be run according to his vision. Younger nurses. Faster throughput. People who don't remember when medicine was about patients instead of metrics. He's already had 3 conversations with hospital administration about workforce development. He's already begun the paper trail, small documentation notes about missed protocols, about suggestions offered in the wrong tone, about a pattern of questioning physician judgment. Nothing that would constitute grounds for termination. Not yet. But enough to create a narrative. Enough that when he eventually recommends her termination, it will seem like the inevitable result of legitimate performance concerns rather than what it actually is, an assassination of character disguised as management. The shift handoff happens at 7:45. The night nurses brief the day shift. 3 critical patients in ICU step down. 1 trauma admission expected from a motorcycle accident on I-10. 1 post-op bleed in recovery that's being monitored closely. Margaret takes notes. She always takes notes. Her notebook has a worn cover from being carried in her pocket for approximately 8 years, and the pages are filled with handwriting that looks like someone taking their job more seriously than anyone around them considers reasonable. A resident named Dr. Chen approaches her during rounds at 8:30. He's fresh out of medical school, maybe 28, with the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing everything and understanding nothing. He asks Margaret about the post-op bleed, specifically about the patient's trend over the last 4 hours. Falling hemoglobin, rising heart rate, blood pressure that's starting to tick sideways. Margaret tells him what she's observed. Hemoglobin dropped 0.4 from 4 a.m. Heart rate up from 68 to 84. BP was 128/80 at 6. Now 122/78. Heading toward hypovolemic compensation. She delivers this information the way someone reads ingredients off a label. Factual. Unemotional. Correct. Dr. Chen nods. He knows she's right. He's smart enough to recognize clinical competence even in its default state. He's about to say something when Ashford appears. He always appears exactly when you're about to acknowledge that the old nurse knows more than everyone else combined. That's an interesting assessment, Miss Walsh, Ashford says, his tone suggesting that interesting is a synonym for wrong. But I think we'll follow actual protocol here. I've ordered a CT angiography to rule out PE. The bleeding is probably just reactive oozing. Post-op inflammatory response. Nothing to panic about. He looks at Dr. Chen. Don't let floor nurses dictate your clinical judgment, doctor. That's how bad medicine happens. The room holds still for exactly 2 seconds. Margaret doesn't move. Doesn't protest. Doesn't tell him that bleeding that only oozes doesn't change hemoglobin at that rate. Doesn't mention that CT angiography requires moving a hemodynamically unstable patient. Doesn't explain that the real danger isn't PE, it's that he's going to waste critical time chasing the wrong diagnosis while a patient bleeds out. She just nods. Just accepts. Just becomes invisible again. Dr. Chen looks between them. He sees the dynamic. He's smart enough to understand that Margaret just offered him a clinical pearl and that his attending just told him to ignore it. He chooses the path of least resistance. Everyone does. The morning rounds continue. The post-op patient goes to CT angiography at 9:15. Margaret monitors the others. Adjusts medications. Changes dressings. Works with the kind of quiet precision that hospitals depend on and never acknowledge. She doesn't think about the patient in CT. That's the way you survive 15 years without losing your mind. You do the job. You don't take it home. You certainly don't dwell on the clinical decisions you could have made if anyone listened to you. But the patient in CT has already started showing signs of distributive shock by 9:45. The CT results come back negative for PE at 10:08. By 10:30, his blood pressure is 104/60. By 11, it's dropping faster. The surgical team finally realizes what Margaret already knew 8 hours ago. There's active bleeding somewhere in the abdomen. Not a leak. A bleed. The kind that kills people. Emergency surgery is called at 11:30. Ashford himself takes the case, because of course he does. This is his chance to salvage his error by demonstrating his technical prowess. Margaret watches him stride toward the surgical suite like a man who's already rewriting the narrative. In 3 hours, when the patient survives, and survives, because the surgeon's technique is actually flawless even if his judgment isn't, Ashford will be the doctor who found the bleed. The one who trusted his instinct over protocol. The one who saved the patient through sheer force of will. Margaret will be the nurse who was too alarmed about normal post-op trends. She finishes her first shift at 4 p.m. Changes out of her scrubs. Packs the clothes in her locker. In 15 minutes, she'll return to the floor for the 16-hour overnight shift. 16 consecutive hours on feet that already ache. In a hospital that's already made clear that her competence is a threat rather than an asset. In a building where she used to have colleagues and now has instead an audience waiting to see when she'll finally break. She touches the dog tag through her scrub top. The metal is warm from her skin. On it is engraved a name, not her name. Ryan, it says. LCPO Ryan Kovacs. SSN ending in 4627. Blood type O negative. And below that, almost worn smooth by decades of touching, Reaper 6. She keeps it close because promises are the only thing that don't expire. Because somewhere out there, a boy she saved once is still alive, still out there. Because she made a commitment 20 years ago that she'd keep her head down, stay hidden, let her service record remain sealed and classified and forgotten in the archives where institutions keep the things they prefer the world doesn't know about. Margaret Walsh returns to the trauma floor at 3:50 p.m. She clocks back in. Ties her scrubs. Becomes invisible again. The night shift is already beginning, and the fluorescent lights hum their eternal hum, and somewhere down the hall, a patient is being prepped for emergency surgery, and no one knows yet that the next 3 days will change everything. The night shift dissolved into morning like all the others, fluorescent lights humming their eternal frequency, monitors beeping their mechanical rhythm, the smell of antiseptic lead thick enough to taste. Margaret finished her charting at 0530 and was reaching for the supply closet when the intercom crackled. Dr. Ashford's voice. Morning rounds. Trauma floor. 30 minutes. She knew what morning rounds meant. An audience. By 0600, Ashford had assembled his entourage like a general inspecting troops, for residents trailing behind him in descending order of confidence, their white coats still crisp, their confidence still untempered by the knowledge that medicine was mostly about managing what you couldn't control and accepting what you couldn't fix. Margaret watched them move through the unit with the kind of precision that only existed in the first weeks of a rotation, before reality wore the shine off their armor. She was checking the dressing on bed 5 when she heard him approaching bed 7. The patient in 7 was Marcus Chen, 62, admitted 3 days ago for a routine appendectomy. Post-op, standard course. Except his white blood cell count had climbed 40% overnight. 13,000 to 18,000. His temperature had spiked at 0 for 47. Just 0.4 degrees, nothing dramatic, but Margaret had spent 15 years reading the small languages bodies spoke before they screamed, and this one was whispering something urgent in a voice only experience could hear. She'd flagged the chart. Added a note. Watched the lab results like a hunter watching brush move in the distance. Ashford stopped at the bedside and glanced at the vitals monitor with the kind of attention a man gives his phone at a stoplight, present but not present. The residents clustered behind him, waiting for wisdom. One of them, a young woman named Dr. Torres, actually leaned forward to read the lab results. Margaret approached with the chart extended like an offering. Doctor, his white count jumped overnight. Elevated temperature at 0 for 47. I think we should start broad-spectrum antibiotics before we wait for culture results. Early sepsis presentation looks like this. Ashford didn't look at her. His eye stayed fixed on the monitor as if she hadn't spoken, as if her voice was simply background noise, like the ventilator hiss, like the heart monitor's persistent beep. He was performing something, Margaret understood. Not medicine. Performance. When he finally turned, his smile was a weapon. Granny Walsh. The word granny landed like a hand on her sternum. When you finish your medical degree from Harvard, publish your research in the Lancet, and acquire even a fraction of my credentials, perhaps I'll consider your diagnoses. Until then, take vitals and let the doctors handle medicine. One of the residents, a man, late 20s, sharp eyes, actually shifted his weight backward. Margaret watched him almost speak. His mouth opened. Then he glanced at Ashford's expression and closed it again. The silence that followed was the kind that calcifies, the kind that makes gravity feel heavier. Margaret's jaw tightened. One muscle. One moment. Then her voice came out level and steady, the voice of someone reading a menu, reading a prescription, reading words that had no weight. I've seen sepsis present this way before. The trajectory suggests. You've seen? Ashford turned fully now, abandoning the patient entirely, making Margaret his stage. Making this about her. You've seen a lot in your long career, haven't you? 15 years of seeing things. Must be exhausting. Maybe it's time you saw retirement. He turned back to the residents without waiting for a response. Standard post-op surveillance. No prophylactic antibiotics without culture confirmation. We don't practice defensive medicine here at Oak Creek Memorial. He moved toward the next bed, his entourage trailing behind like pilot fish behind a shark, and Margaret was left standing there with the chart still in her hands and the thought that this was exactly what he wanted, to make her small enough that her voice stopped having frequency, stopped having power. The rest of the rounds took 45 minutes. Margaret returned to her work. The ticking clock in her chest didn't stop. At 0915, Ashford posted the new staff assignments on the unit board at Central Station. But that wasn't the only thing he posted. A sheet of paper, white, official letterhead, clipped directly above the schedule where every nurse, every resident, every doctor and visitor walking past would see it. Margaret read her own professional execution from 3 feet away. Incident report. Margaret Walsh. Date: yesterday. Time: 03:42 to 04:03. Charge: insubordination. Charge: questioning direct physician orders. Charge: creating a hostile work environment through repeated assertions of authority beyond her scope. Recommendation: immediate disciplinary review. Signature: Dr. Samuel Ashford, Chief of Surgery. The document was laminated, as if he wanted to ensure its permanence, as if he was documenting her extinction. She stood there for 30 seconds. Just 30 seconds. Long enough for Linda to walk past and suddenly need something from the med room. Long enough for Karen to remember an urgent call. Long enough for 3 other nurses to see her standing there and find reasons to be somewhere else, anywhere else, than near her. The silence in those 30 seconds was so thick you could operate in it. Margaret didn't blink. Didn't flush. Didn't let her shoulders curve inward. She simply read every word with the same attention she'd give to a medication label, to a patient's oxygen saturation, to any other piece of data that existed without judgment or emotion. Then she turned and walked toward the supply closet, moving with the kind of precision that comes from having made 1,000 small decisions about what kind of woman she would be when everyone was watching. The supply closet door locked from the inside. Margaret sat on the bottom shelf where the extra linens were stacked, surrounded by the chemical smell of bleached cotton and the faint hum of the fax system overhead. One tear escaped before she could stop it, just one, traitorous and small, rolling down her cheek like a mistake. She wiped it away without ceremony, without rage, without anything at all, then stood and exited the closet and returned to her patients. But that wasn't the worst part. At 1200, when Margaret was administering post-op pain medication to a patient in bed 3, she noticed something in the corner of her vision. The break room. The staff table where she'd eaten lunch with the same 3 nurses for nearly a decade. Where Linda had shown pictures of her grandchildren. Where Karen had talked about her daughter's college scholarship. Where Jess had mentioned her divorce and Margaret had listened without judgment, without advice, just the simple presence of someone who understood that some things couldn't be fixed. Margaret sat at that table with her salad in a plastic container and her coffee in a hospital-issue mug, waiting for the familiar rhythm of work conversation, the way nurses spoke in fragments and shorthand when they got off their feet. Linda looked up from her phone. Saw Margaret. Something flickered across her face, recognition, then something else, something like fear mixed with calculation. Linda's eyes moved toward the bulletin board. Toward the incident report. Then back to the doorway. Oh, Linda said to no one in particular. I just remembered I need to check the medication room. She left without finishing her sandwich. Karen followed 30 seconds later. Charts to review. Jess, the last of the 3, didn't even pretend. She simply stood up and walked out. The fluorescent light above the table buzzed and buzzed and buzzed. Margaret ate slowly. 1 lettuce leaf at a time. 1 deliberate bite. The coffee was cold. She drank it anyway. Around her, the break room continued its function, other nurses eating, talking, laughing in the way that excludes. The way that says you are not part of our story anymore. The way that transforms a colleague into an obstacle, an incident report into prophecy. When she finished, she carried her empty container to the trash. Rinsed her mug. Dried it. Returned to the floor. That afternoon, she caught the reflection of herself in the glass partition of the supply room. 49 years old, grey starting to show at the temples, lines around her eyes from 15 years of fluorescent lighting and third shifts and patients who didn't survive despite everything she'd done. A nurse. Just a nurse. The incident report had called her by her first name, had documented her mistakes like scripture, and nobody had argued. Not one person had said, "That's not who she is. That's not what I saw." The isolation was so complete it was almost clean. Around 14:30, just as the afternoon shift was ramping up, Margaret noticed something through the trauma bay window. A change in the radio traffic. A crackle that sounded different. The kind of alert that made even the newer residents pause whatever they were doing. The intercom squealed. A woman's voice, sharp with urgency. Medevac alert. Military trauma inbound. ETA 6 minutes. Medevac alert. Military trauma inbound. ETA 6 minutes. The word seemed to echo through the hallway twice. Military. Trauma. Inbound. The kind of alert that didn't happen in Houston on a regular Tuesday. The kind that meant GSWs, blast injuries, the kind of damage that civilian trauma surgery was designed for but rarely prepared for. Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Something mechanical. Something that had been dormant for 20 years. She was 3 hours into her second double shift, exhausted in the way that comes from being slowly erased from your own workplace, when she heard the rotor wash begin to shake the windows of the trauma bay. The medevac alert screamed through Oak Creek Memorial at 0342 like a siren that wouldn't stop, penetrating, insistent, impossible to ignore. Margaret heard it from the supply closet where she was cataloging bandage stock, heard it the way you hear your name spoken in a room full of people. Rotor wash began to shake the windows of the trauma bay. The hospital's entire rhythm shifted in 3 seconds. Trauma. Incoming. 15 years and Margaret's body knew the pattern before her mind caught up, the subtle acceleration in footsteps, the sharp intake of breath from the charge nurse, the fluorescent light seeming to buzz louder as if the building itself was holding its breath. The call came through the overhead speaker, critical GSW and tension pneumothorax, Navy SEAL, medevac from Tikrit via Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, ETA 8 minutes. Margaret's hand stopped moving. Tikrit. That name carried weight she hadn't allowed herself to carry in 2 decades. She set down the bandage box and walked toward the trauma bay without deciding to walk, pulled in by something deeper than protocol, something that lived in the scar tissue of her palms. By the time Ryan Kovacs was wheeled through the automatic doors on a stretcher, the entire team was positioned like chess pieces, respiratory therapist at the head, 2 surgical nurses flanking the gurney, a resident barking vitals. Margaret stood 3 feet from the entrance, watching. The patient was massive, muscled like someone who spent his life training, but the body on the stretcher was a shell, pale, shaking, a combat dressing already soaked through on his right anterior chest. Oxygen mask fogged with each breath. Monitors screaming. And then Margaret saw his face. 20 years dissolved. 8 years old, trapped in a burning Humvee in Tikrit, coughing through black smoke while Margaret climbed through the rear window with flames licking the metal frame. The boy's hand gripping her combat vest like it was the only solid thing in a world coming apart. The same bone structure underneath the beard, the same dark eyes, now wider with pain than they'd ever been with fear. Her breath caught, not visibly, not in any way that would show. Just an internal stutter, the way your heart skips when you recognize a ghost. Beside the stretcher was a woman in her 30s, dark hair plastered to her face with sweat, her hand gripping the stretcher bar with white knuckles. Ryan's wife. She was crying, whispering his name like it was a prayer that might work if she said it enough times. Margaret moved without being asked. She was already at the trauma bay entrance, already sliding into position at Ryan's right side, her mind splitting into 2 channels, one assessing the clinical crisis in front of her, one swimming backward through 20 years of classified memories. Tension pneumothorax. She could see it in the way his right lung had collapsed, the way his breathing was coming in short, desperate gasps. The medics had done field triage, but the clinical window was shrinking. Every second his oxygen saturation dropped represented brain cells dying, and Margaret's hands were already reaching for what she needed before her conscious mind had spoken the orders aloud. Tension pneumothorax, she said, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the trauma bay. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Now. Dr. Ashford appeared like he'd been waiting offstage for his entrance. His timing was precise, surgical even, appearing at the moment Margaret began moving toward the crash cart where the 14-gauge needles were kept. He hadn't been in the trauma bay 30 seconds before he positioned himself between Margaret and the patient, his voice dropping to that particular register of authority that required no volume to command the room. Imaging first, Ashford said. His eyes moved to Ryan's wife for one calculated second, a brief performance of reassurance. Protocol requires we confirm pneumothorax with imaging before we intervene. We're not a backwater clinic. The words landed like stones in still water. Margaret saw the wife's face crumple further, saw her search for understanding in the chaos. Ashford's hand was already moving toward the phone to call for a portable chest X-ray. Margaret felt the moment stretching, felt the mathematics of oxygen deprivation ticking forward in Ryan's blood. 82%. Falling. 78. Falling still. The machine was being honest about what was happening. Ryan's lungs weren't exchanging oxygen anymore. His cells were beginning to drown in their own fluids. Margaret moved. She didn't ask permission. She didn't make eye contact with Ashford. She simply pivoted toward the crash cart with the fluidity of someone who had done this exact motion 1,000 times, in operating theaters and mud huts and vehicles with sandstorm howling outside. Her fingers found the 14-gauge needle with the precision of a pianist finding middle C. She was at Ryan's bedside, ribs exposed under the emergency gown, her left hand locating the second intercostal space while her right hand raised the needle to the skin. Nurse Walsh, step back from that patient. Ashford's voice cracked with anger, the kind of anger that comes from being defied in front of witnesses. Margaret inserted the needle. The hiss of escaping air filled the entire trauma bay, a sound like pressure releasing from an ancient valve, like the world taking its first real breath in hours. Oxygen began flowing properly through Ryan's lungs. The monitors responded before anyone could process what had just happened. 82. 91. 95. Saturation climbing like a plane lifting off the runway, climbing so fast that Margaret's eyes tracked it the way you track something that was meant to happen and finally is. Ryan's wife gasped. She gripped the stretcher bar and gasped again, tears spilling faster now, but different tears. Tears of recognition. She had just watched her husband cross back from the precipice. For one moment, one perfect, crystalline moment, everyone in the trauma bay understood exactly what had happened. The protocol that would have killed him. The nurse who had saved him. The surgeon who had tried to stop her. Dr. Ashford's face turned crimson. Not embarrassed red. Furious red. The red of a man who had just lost control of the room and knew everyone had seen it. "Security," he called out. His voice was steady again, but something underneath it had cracked open. "Remove this nurse from my trauma bay immediately." 2 security guards appeared before Margaret could even lower the needle, and Margaret understood then that they had been stationed outside, that Ashford had anticipated this moment, had prepared for the possibility that she might do exactly what she had just done. They approached from behind, their movements professional but their intent unmistakable. They took her by both arms. Margaret didn't resist. She never resisted. She simply turned her head so she could see Ryan's wife one more time. "He's going to make it now," Margaret said quietly. Her voice was the voice of someone speaking from absolute certainty, the voice of someone who had seen this exact pattern before and knew how it ended. "Watch his right lung carefully. Make sure they monitor for re-expansion pulmonary edema. It happens sometimes when the lung comes back online too fast." The wife nodded, crying harder, understanding that something essential had just been transferred to her: knowledge, trust, the weight of caring for someone who had been dying and was now, impossibly, living. They escorted Margaret out into the hallway where the fluorescent lights buzzed their eternal mechanical song. She didn't look back. As they walked toward the elevator bank, she heard Ashford's voice behind her, already on his phone. The fragments came through clearly: personnel file, need to pull her entire record, liability concerns, psychiatric evaluation, board meeting tomorrow morning. The security guards released her at the nurse's station. Margaret stood there for exactly 30 seconds, watching the entrance to the trauma bay through the small window in the door. Ashford was already moving through the bay like a man collecting pieces of a broken vase, speaking rapidly to each nurse who had witnessed the needle decompression. She saw him touch Linda's shoulder, redirect her attention, reassign her with a gesture and a murmur. "Pediatrics." She heard the word. Karen was next, his hand in the small of her back, a guide away from the trauma bay, away from being a witness. Oncology. His allies in the ICU were suddenly receiving phone calls, requests for float assignments, subtle pressure that would remove every nurse who had watched a protocol-breaking save unfold. He was erasing the witnesses. 2 hours later, Ashford altered the surgical schedule on the computer terminal at the nurse's station. Margaret watched from outside the locked staff door, seeing his fingers move across the keyboard with the precision of someone making sure all the evidence pointed the way he wanted it to point. His allies were moved to Ryan's surgical team. His people would write the incident report. The narrative was being constructed in real time, not around what had actually happened, but around what Ashford needed to have happened. When he passed her in the hallway outside the break room, he walked with the hospital board chairman beside him, both of them in conversation low enough to require leaning close. Margaret stood against the wall, perfectly still, her hands at her sides. Ashford didn't acknowledge her existence, but she heard his voice shift, heard it become concerned, measured, the voice of a dedicated physician worried about patient safety. Dangerous employee, he was saying. Possible combat stress disorder. The kind of person who acts without thinking, breaks protocols that exist for a reason. Patient safety must come first, always. The board chairman was nodding, taking it in, his expression moving from neutral to troubled. Margaret didn't move. She let the words land on her like rain on concrete, let them soak in and run off. Her jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough to feel it in her temples. A single tear escaped, just one, just the physical release of pressure, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Ashford as he moved past her. He saw the tear. His sneer widened, thinking it was fear, thinking it was doubt. He didn't understand that what he was looking at was restraint. The difference between us, Doctor, Margaret said quietly, her voice barely loud enough to carry to where he stood, is that I've already decided which lives matter more than my career. Ashford didn't respond. He didn't slow his pace. But his sneer faltered for 1 microsecond, the moment a predator realizes there might be something standing in front of him that isn't prey. Then he continued walking, and Margaret was left standing alone in the hallway as the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in amber, her hand still steady, her breath still measured, everything about her composed except for the single wet streak drying on her cheek. What happened next would determine whether her career survived the night. Margaret's hands moved before conscious thought caught up. The needle was already in her grip, a 14-gauge angiocath from the crash cart, her fingers finding the second intercostal space with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this in Kandahar by headlamp, in Mosul under mortar fire, in a dozen places that didn't officially exist on any map. Ashford's voice was still talking, still explaining why protocol demanded imaging first, but she wasn't listening anymore. She was looking at Ryan's oxygen saturation, 68 and dropping. His chest wall was caving inward with each desperate breath. The tension pneumothorax was compressing his heart. She stepped toward the patient bed. "Excuse me." Ashford's voice took on that edge he used when someone questioned him. "I didn't give you permission to." The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping was the only sound that mattered. Margaret's free hand was already on Ryan's shoulder, steadying him, her eyes tracking the monitor as his oxygen began to climb. 72. 78. 82. The color was coming back into his face. His wife's hand found Margaret's arm, gripping it like a life raft. Ashford's face went the color of old wine. "Security." He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. 2 uniformed officers appeared from the hallway. They'd been stationed there, Margaret realized with sudden clarity, waiting for exactly this. Remove this nurse from the trauma bay. Now. One of them was Jenkins, the guard who'd brought her coffee last month when she was working a double. His eyes wouldn't meet hers as he approached. The other one, younger, maybe 23, looked genuinely uncomfortable but reached for her arm anyway. Margaret didn't resist. She pulled off her gloves, set down the needle driver she'd been holding in reserve, and walked with them into the hallway without looking back. Behind her, she heard Ashford's voice, resume, steady and professional, explaining to Ryan's wife that they would monitor his status closely, that the situation was now under control. The lies came as naturally to him as breathing. The hallway was fluorescent bright and utterly silent. Margaret had walked this corridor 10,000 times in 15 years, but today the tiles under her feet felt like a stranger's floor. Jenkins and the younger officer flanked her as she moved toward the staff room, their presence heavy as stone. No one else was in the hallway. It was 6 in the morning. Most of the hospital was still sleeping, unaware that a war was being fought in white coats and scrubs. By 8 o'clock, there was a printed memo on the unit board. Margaret read it while standing at the coffee station in the break room, coffee cooling in her hand. The words were careful, bureaucratic, designed to sound reasonable. Incident report, insubordination and protocol violation. RN Margaret Walsh performed unauthorized clinical procedures in direct contradiction to attending physician directive. Patient safety concern elevated to HR and risk management. Immediate retraining required. See administrator for scheduling. Her hands were steady as she read it. Not a tremor. Not even the smallest flinch. Just her eyes moving across the word someone else had chosen to define her. Around 10, Ashford walked past her in the hallway with the hospital board chairman, a tall man in an expensive suit whose name was Pierce, and whose foundation donations funded half the expansions the hospital had done in the last 5 years. Ashford was talking about difficult personnel situations and the importance of maintaining hierarchy. As they passed Margaret, Ashford turned his head and let his eyes slide across her with a sneer that was purely theatrical, the kind of cruelty that worked best when performed for an audience. The board chairman didn't even look at her. Margaret stood motionless, letting the moment settle into her shoulders like snow. One measured breath. Another. Her hands were at her sides, and something in her chest was trying to break loose, not fear, not anger, something older and deeper. The kind of feeling that came from knowing exactly what was happening and being powerless to stop it through any conventional means. A single tear escaped before she could stop it. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with the hallway's empty space, her jaw tight, her spine straighter than before. Ashford was 3 steps away when she spoke. Her voice was quiet, not loud enough to carry beyond his ears, not loud enough to draw attention. Just loud enough for him to hear. The difference between us, Doctor, is that I've already decided which lives matter more than my career. He didn't break stride. Didn't acknowledge that he'd heard her. But his shoulders tensed for just a moment, and Margaret saw his hand tighten on his briefcase. He kept walking, the board chairman still talking beside him about operational efficiency and sustainable staffing models. Margaret turned back to the nurse's station and clocked out. She spent the next 2 hours in her car in the parking lot, watching the ER entrance. Her phone sat silent in her lap. No one called. No one texted. The nurses she'd shared coffee with for 15 years didn't reach out. The residents she'd trained, who'd learned to read a patient's face by watching her, they were probably already absorbing Ashford's version of the morning, the one where Margaret had been reckless and emotional and dangerous. At 6:47, the code alarm screamed through the hospital. It came through the external speaker mounted on the emergency bay wall, and Margaret heard it even with her car windows up. Not an ordinary code. A trauma code. She knew the room number before the intercom announced it, Trauma Bay 4. That was where they'd taken Ryan. That was his room. She was out of the car before the announcement finished. The hospital corridors were chaos, residents moving fast, nurses responding, a level of urgency that meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. Margaret's badge had been deactivated that morning. She'd felt the nurse at the front desk's apologetic glance as she tried to swipe it coming in, but she knew how to move through a hospital without being obvious about it. She kept to the peripheral corridors, used the staff stairwell, came up behind the occupied observation area where a small crowd of residents and nurses were gathering. Through the window of Trauma Bay 4, she could see everything. Ryan's oxygen saturation was 42. His heart rate was 28. The young resident on duty was standing frozen in the center of the room, hands at his sides, looking at the monitor like he expected it to give him answers. A code team was assembling, someone pushing the crash cart, someone else yelling for more hands, but nobody was giving orders. Nobody was taking charge. The heart monitor was screaming, a continuous wail that meant no electrical activity, no pulse, nothing but a flat line pretending to be alive. The tension pneumothorax had worsened. The misdiagnosis, compounded over 2 hours, had turned into a complete cardiovascular collapse. Ryan was dying. For the second time in his life, with Margaret watching, Ryan Kovacs was dying. His wife was pressed against the back wall, screaming his name. There was a security guard stationed outside the trauma bay door. Jenkins. The same guard who'd escorted Margaret out of the hospital 2 hours earlier. He was standing with his hands clasped in front of him, following his orders, "Don't let Margaret Walsh inside." Margaret moved. Not fast, not dramatic, just the economical movement of someone who'd made a decision and was acting on it. She walked directly toward the door. Jenkins saw her coming and stepped forward to block her path, his hand already rising in that apologetic but firm gesture. "I can't let you." Margaret met his eyes. Just met them. Not angry, not pleading. Just absolute command presence, the kind that came from having led people through the worst moments of their lives. Jenkins's hand dropped. He stepped back. He didn't understand why, exactly, something in her face, something in the way she moved, but his body obeyed before his brain caught up. Margaret opened the door and stepped inside. Locked it behind her before anyone could follow. "Thoracotomy." Her voice cut through the alarm like a blade. Not a request. Not a question. A command delivered by someone whose authority was so absolute that the young resident on duty immediately moved toward the crash cart without questioning it. 14-gauge angiocath, scalpel, rib retractor. Now. The equipment arrived in her hands like she'd summoned it into being. The crash cart's anesthesia resident, a woman named Chen who'd worked with Margaret before, back when Margaret was still permitted to train residents, handed her the scalpel without a word, trusting muscle memory over protocol, trusting Margaret's voice over the chaos of the flat line. Ryan's heart rate was 0. His pupils fixed and dilated. Clinically dead by every measure that mattered. Margaret made the incision between his 4th and 5th ribs with the precision of someone who'd done this in caves and forward operating bases, in the dark and under fire, with mortar rounds landing close enough to feel the concussion in her sternum. Her hands didn't shake. They never shook when it mattered. The ribs parted under the retractor. The pericardium opened. Her fingers found his heart, slick and still and cold. She began compressions. Manual. Direct. The kind of field medicine they taught you when you stopped being a nurse and became a trauma surgeon operating without authorization or equipment or hope. 1 milligram epi, for push, she said, and someone behind her was already reaching for the medication. The world had compressed down to Ryan's heart and the monitor behind her and the sound of her own breathing, controlled and rhythmic. 40 compressions. His heart responded, a flutter, weak and irregular. She squeezed again. 60. The monitor picked up a rhythm. 80. Regular sinus. His oxygen saturation began to climb. 100. The monitor beeped once. Twice. Steady rhythm, 84 beats per minute. His wife was sobbing against the back wall, her hand over her mouth, her eyes locked on Margaret's face like Margaret had just reached down and hauled her entire world back from the edge of an abyss. Because she had. Margaret stepped back. Washed her hands at the sink with the same calm deliberation she used to start every shift. The water was warm. The soap smelled like the same brand they'd used for 15 years. Everything was normal except that everything had changed. The door handle rattled. Hard. Someone on the other side trying to force it open. Margaret dried her hands on a paper towel and unlocked the door. Dr. Ashford stood there with 2 security officers and a woman from HR, all of them in a state of controlled fury. His face was flushed. His eyes had that look of someone watching his entire world view implode in real time. "Margaret Walsh," he said, and his voice was shaking with rage barely contained, "you are terminated effective immediately. Badge. Now." She unclipped it from her waistband and handed it over without a word. Her expression was the same as always, composed, professional, a nurse following orders. Except that her eyes held something Ashford couldn't quite name, something that made him take a small step backward as she walked past him. The parking lot was empty at 6:52 a.m. Concrete stretching out like a grey ocean. The security officers watched her walk to her Honda, watched her get in, watched her drive away into the pre-dawn darkness. No one tried to stop her. There was nothing left to stop, nothing left to defend against. Margaret drove for 40 minutes without any destination in mind, just moving, breathing, staying in motion because stopping meant feeling everything she'd held back for 2 hours. The rain started somewhere around Bellaria, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the windshield like applause from the universe's cruelest audience. She pulled into Shady Grove Cemetery at 7:43 a.m. The grave was in the southeast corner, under an oak tree that had been small when she'd buried her husband there, 22 years ago. Major Thomas Walsh, 1971 to 2002. Special Forces. Killed in action. The dates meant nothing to her anymore, she'd lived more years without him than with him, but the stone was still smooth under her fingertips when she touched it. She held the dog tag Ryan had pressed into her palm 20 years ago, the chain broken from wearing it against her heart for 2 decades. It was still warm from her skin. Still warm, like it had never stopped believing in her. "I promised you I'd keep my head down," she whispered to the stone, to the rain, to the universe. That I'd stay hidden like they ordered after the operation was buried. But I couldn't watch that boy die twice. The rain mixed with tears she finally allowed herself. 20 years of holding it in, of staying quiet, of being invisible. For what? So that men like Ashford could play at being doctors while people died. "I broke my cover," she said, and her voice carried across the empty cemetery. "I broke everything. And I'd do it again." She stayed until the rain stopped and her clothes were soaked through and her hands had gone numb from the cold. Then she drove to her apartment, a small 2-bedroom in Midtown that had never felt like home, and waited in the dark for whatever came next. 3 days passed like water through her fingers. Margaret didn't leave the apartment. Didn't check her phone. Didn't turn on the news or scroll through messages from people who'd abandoned her without even knowing what they were abandoning. She sat at her kitchen table and stared at the wall and tried not to think about the career she'd just destroyed by doing the only thing that mattered. On the 3rd day, the phone rang. Dr. Ashford didn't scream. He didn't rage. He simply closed his office door and opened Margaret's personnel file with the methodical precision of a surgeon preparing instruments for a procedure he'd performed 1,000 times before. His assistant had sent him the preliminary incident report from Trauma Bay 3, unauthorized medical intervention, protocol violation, patient endangerment. The words were there. The facts were not. Margaret had performed open-chest resuscitation on a patient he'd already declared unsalvageable, and somehow, impossibly, the Navy SEAL had survived. The monitor in the ICU was still beeping. The patient's wife was still crying into her husband's hand. And Dr. Jonathan Ashford was facing a scenario he'd never actually contemplated, being upstaged by a nurse with 15 years of quiet competence and no institutional power to protect herself with. He picked up his phone. Not to confront her. Not to rage. To strategize. Within 90 minutes, he'd made calls to 6 department heads, reassigning every nurse and resident who'd been in that trauma bay to different floors, different shifts, different rotations. Linda, who'd brought Margaret coffee for 11 years. Karen, who'd whispered encouragement during the thoracotomy. Jess, the newest resident, whose eyes had widened with something that looked terrifyingly like admiration when she watched Margaret's hands move with combat field precision. Gone. Redistributed. Isolated. The message was clear: bear witness against me and you leave this hospital. No one said it aloud. No one had to. the surgical schedule for the next 2 weeks suddenly required his personal approval. Every incident report, every post-operative evaluation, every detail of the unauthorized procedure would flow through his office first. His allies, the anesthesiologist who'd supported his bid for chief of surgery, the OR nurses who owed him shift preferences, the junior resident who'd been promised a research fellowship, would control the official narrative. By the time anyone outside his inner circle saw documentation of what Margaret had actually done, the framing would be fixed. Reckless. Insubordinate. Potentially dangerous. The truth, carefully buried under language that sounded clinical and professional but meant only one thing: she had to go. That afternoon, Dr. Ashford made 4 phone calls to board members. Soft calls, careful calls, the kind that sounded like genuine medical concern rather than character assassination. "I'm worried about her mental state," he said to the board chairman, his voice carrying the weight of someone deeply troubled. Performing unauthorized surgery, ignoring chain of command, responding to an emergency that wasn't technically hers to handle. That's not protocol violation. That's a breakdown. He paused, letting the implication settle. "I'm recommending we document this formally and consider a psychological evaluation. For her safety. For the hospital's liability." The chairman made a sound that could have been agreement. Could have been something else entirely. Ashford didn't need certainty. He needed doubt. He needed the board to see her not as a skilled nurse but as a liability. Security arrived at 3:19 p.m. 2 uniformed officers, professional and neutral, with Margaret's termination paperwork already signed by the Chief of Human Resources. Her badge was deactivated before they even reached her station. The charges were listed precisely: violation of surgical chain of command, unauthorized medical intervention without physician approval, failure to follow established protocol, patient endangerment through independent clinical decision-making. Each phrase was crafted perfectly, technically accurate, deeply misleading, and impossible for her to defend without saying the actual truth, that she'd performed a field thoracotomy with precision that only combat medicine training could explain. She couldn't invoke her military record without breaking 20 years of silence. She couldn't explain where she'd learned to do emergency open chest resuscitation without revealing an identity that was supposed to stay buried. So she stood quietly, collected her personal items from her locker in a cardboard box, and walked out through the emergency department she'd worked in longer than most staff had been alive. The rain started as she pulled out of the parking lot. Not a drizzle. Real rain, the kind that hammered against her windshield like applause from a crowd that didn't exist. Margaret drove to Glenwood Cemetery on the west side of Houston, tires hissing against wet asphalt, the city blurring into watercolor behind her tears. She found David's grave without looking at the GPS, muscle memory from 5 years of weekly visits. The headstone was modest. PFC David Michael Kovacs, 1975 to 2003. Beloved father. Devoted husband. In service to his country. She knelt in the mud, 15 years of restraint finally breaking, and pressed the dog tag against her chest. The chain was broken now, the link separated where Ryan had snapped it off her neck in that Tikrit compound 20 years ago, pressing the single tag into her palm before the extraction helicopter screamed overhead. "I promised you," Margaret whispered to the rain and the stone and the ghost she'd carried for 2 decades. "I promised I'd keep my head down. That I'd stay hidden like they ordered. Like the Pentagon demanded when they debriefed us both and erased the operation from every database except the ones in the Pentagon's classified vaults." Her voice cracked. "The only time that night that it would. I was supposed to be invisible. Just a nurse. A quiet woman with steady hands who went to work and went home and never spoke about what we did in Tikrit, what we accomplished, what it cost." She looked up at the sky and the rain hammered down harder, soaking through her scrubs, turning the grass beneath her into mud. "But I couldn't watch that boy die twice. Even if it meant losing everything. Even if it meant losing you all over again." She stayed at David's grave until the rain stopped. She didn't call anyone. She didn't apply for new jobs or lawyer up or fight the termination. She simply drove home, dried off in the shower, and sat at her kitchen table staring at the wall for 3 days. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep much. She did answer the phone on day 3 when it rang at 6:43 a.m., the number unfamiliar, the voice on the other end crisp and military in a way that made her entire body go rigid. "Major Walsh," the voice said. Not a question. A confirmation. "This is Admiral James Halloway, U.S. Navy Special Operations Command. I think we need to talk about what happens next. If you love a good underdog story, hit that like button now. Subscribe so you never miss one. And comment below, have you ever been the underdog? Let's see how this plays out.